Thank you for inviting me, and ET and ET Markets. Thank you for hosting this conference. This is absolutely a fantastic conference. I was listening to a couple of earlier sessions. It's really very informative. Uh, I have the honor and pleasure of welcoming and hosting Mr. KV Kamath. I call him a visionary banker, and it fits in very well with the topic which we have as we reset Indian economy as we come out of the pandemic, visualizing the next 5 years. And we couldn't have had a better person than Mr. Kamath really talking on that. Why do I say visionary banker rather than doing a normal introduction? I do want to share a couple of my own experiences with him as anecdote. Uh, this was in 1996 when Mr. Kamath came back to ICICI, which people were eagerly awaiting that moment. And first thing at that point of time, you imagine a situation in 96, you had development financial institutions like IDBI, ICICI, IFCI, and he came back and said, look, he wants to focus on retail. And we were wondering why focus on retail? And that's the vision that DFI is going to get converted into retail. You saw what happened with ICICI Bank and with some others. The second anecdote which I wanted to cite is this was 1999. Mr. Kamath always believed in technology. At that time in 99, we had two ATMs in the city of Bombay. One, if I remember correctly, was of Citibank and one HSBC. And at that time, he said he wants to introduce ATM by an Indian bank, and the rest is history. We've seen how the technology has just overtaken the banking and the banking sector. And similarly, when it came to lending, most of the banks and the development financial institutions, they were focused on corporate lending. And he brought in the culture of retail lending through mortgage and the credit card and all of that. And now we see how the whole Indian economy has changed. So, Mr. Kamath, we really remember all those. And therefore, when we talked about the next 5 years, we thought, who other than you? And as Vijay mentioned, obviously, there are a lot of things which we can keep talking about this. Apart from that, Mr. Kamath more recently has been CEO of New Development Bank till recently, which is popularly known as BRICS Bank, also non-executive chairman of Infosys, the second largest technology company in the country, the boards of multiple global corporates. But most importantly, he's been a strategist, advisor, and mentor to not only corporate India, but also to the government. Whenever a difficult situation comes up, people knock at his door. Recently, Reserve Bank of India uh, knocked at his door for setting up NPA framework post-pandemic. So we are here, Mr. Kamath, to hear your views for the next 5 years. Uh, why don't I start with one simple perspective, which is as we look at next 5 years, and particularly resetting the economy as it comes out of the pandemic, uh, investment becomes the most important. Government has announced a very interesting policy called Atmanirbhar Bharat. It's a whole package, and where there's a big focus on investment. What is your view of some of the schemes which are being rolled out, like PLI and all of that? Weave that into with your vision of currency, which is stable, interest rates which are low. That is a big impetus to the for the growth. How do you see that panning out in the next couple of years, in the 5 years?
Thank you, Sunil. You're very kind in your introduction. Let me put things in context. A year back or so, March to be exact, we were in shock. We did not think that the shock would wear off pretty quickly. Things have worn off for the better, and we are sitting today in a much more comfortable position than any one of us could have imagined. In fact, I would dare say that in several areas we are in a better position than where we were coming into this crisis. Just look at early numbers from Q3. And I was just tracking the numbers, 110 or so companies that have reported. And I find PAT is up 30 to 35%. The same previous quarter. For a much larger sample, it was up about 25%. What I'm trying to say is that India has come back at speed. And something very important has happened, which, in a way segues into Atmanirbharata. Talking to Indian industry leaders, I understand now that they have worked, let us say, on the shop floor with just 75% of the staff they would normally have. And they have found out something interesting. They can continue to work with this improved efficiency levels going forward. Yes, we may have to reskill and redeploy the people, but productivity gains, which otherwise would have taken us, 10 years, 15 years, and a large investment requirement, have been brought about by a change in mindset. So this pandemic has, in a way, turned out to be good because it has allowed us to, I would say, squeeze out productivity gains at the shop floor and indeed in the white collar environment. White collar was very easy to see, but I never expected that it would happen at the shop floor level. Now, this plays into Atmanirbharata because imagine if you have a 25% productivity jump, you are world beaters. You are world beaters in terms of your production efficiency. Now, what you need to make sure is that you have to go up the quality equation. There again, I think in the last 15 years, India has gone pretty high up the quality equation. That can be ratcheted up. But to support this, you require two things, and you briefly mentioned them. Right on interest rate environment and a right exchange rate environment. Because we're not looking at a one-year flash in the pan. We're looking at this as a sustained growth to 5 years and maybe 10 years. I will pick only two, I would say, reference points. Japan in the 60s and 70s and China in the 90s. Japan, when they went into a growth momentum or a growth cycle, the exchange rate was 350 yen to the dollar. And by the time they were at their peak, the exchange rate had dropped to below 100 to the dollar. And interest rates stayed steady. Take China. Both indices have dropped dramatically. If I look at exchange rates, late 90s, 8.5 renminbi to the dollar. Today, 6.5 renminbi to the dollar. Never has it crossed 8.5 during the growth momentum phase. And interest rates, of course, we all know what it is. Borrowers can get money at 5.5 to 6%. The prime is just below 5%. So intuitively, you can figure out that two preconditions to sustained growth are interest rates which are low and exchange rates which are, in a way, attractive and I would say stable. You cannot grow in a situation where exchange rates fluctuate and all the time, moving weaker and weaker. So I would leave this to the experts, the policymakers, but I would think that these are two preconditions in addition to the steps the government has taken to make Atmanirbharata the way forward. I would think that this is going to be a great success, the Atmanirbharata mission as it were, because it has come at a time when we were ready to do a reset of the mind, and that reset of the mind has resulted in a whole lot of common good, as it were. One other thing on Atmanirbharata, clearly the incentive scheme around the PLI and other things which will facilitate this, I would look at these as catalysts. But ultimately, we have to make this into an engine which is driving on its own momentum, because it has to last for a very long period of time. It's a great catalyst that has been put into the chemical mix, as it were. And I'm sure we will now aspire to grow at the numbers that the government set, a 5-year number that they've already given. Maybe the government will come out with a 10-year number, which we will all try out and achieve. If you look at interest rates, we need to look at why interest rates are high. The answer is known, because of inflation. And we need to look at what is causing the inflationary challenges, try to address it. But more important, I think we need to at every stage ask a question, is an interest rate increase the right medicine? Or are we giving a medicine which may or may not be relevant at this point in time? Again, if you look at the budget, any budget of a government can be broken into two parts. What is on what I call developmental expenditure, and what is other expenditure of the government. My hypothesis is that developmental expenditure, honestly, in a developing country context, adding it to a deficit needs to be re-examined in today's world. Uh, are these developmental expenditures, can they be met outside the budget through appropriate mechanisms so that you get a true and fair picture of the deficit? Because these are the reasons why you end up keeping the interest rate high. An inflationary fear for various reasons, and then again, as a panacea for inflation when it happens, and so on. I think a whole lot of examination is required as we drive towards these aspirational levels of growth. I picked up uh, interest rate as an example, but very briefly on exchange rates. If you remember, you quoted the time period 99. 99, our exchange rate was around 40 to the dollar. Right up to 2008 or so, it remained at around 40, 41, 42,
Yeah.
kept going in that range. It actually came down to 38 just before 2008 briefly. I'm not. And then you allowed it to weaken. Now we need to examine why did it get weaker? And what is it that we might have done right or wrong at that point in time in terms of the exchange rate? And if you remember, from 48 to 52, and then speculators got into the act, they forecast it will be 60, and indeed it became 60. Then they said 65, it became 65. So we actually lost, in a way, control of the people who were trying to play with the exchange rate. So all these things we need to keep in mind as you look at exchange rates. And countries which have grown at very rapid rates, by that I mean double digit and above, for sustained periods of time, I think key things that they control, apart from providing a facilitative environment, were interest rates and exchange. Let me start with NPA, because that was the first one that you mentioned. On the NPA front, actually, when I looked at the numbers early last year, that is in January of last year, I think I saw a picture where most of the banking sector was already cleaned up. And actually, if you remember, at that point of time, the finger pointing was the banks were not lending. The cleanup had happened, and there was some capital to be brought in by the government. The government brought in that capital for some of the public sector lenders. The private sector is where I think fairly well capitalized. B, in terms of their balance sheets, a cleanup had already been done.
Yeah.
The past 3 years. So we came into the crisis with fairly strong balance sheets and balance sheets which were cleaned up. So there is not much of a residue that had to be addressed during the last 1 year. The anticipation was that the crisis, the pandemic that hit us, would result in completely broken corporate balance sheets and consequently banking balance sheets. That has not happened. So let us not, in a way, overreact. And because I hear this talk, bank capitalization, bank cleanup. Bank cleanup has been done. Handholding might be required, but that's completely different from cleanup. Recapitalization of banks, in a way, has been done. And nothing has been broken in the last 1 year because banks have been prudent. I think Reserve Bank has been extremely prudent and cautious. Banks have continued to make provisions on what they could think could be the things that could slip. But having said that, you look at the anecdotal evidence. Anecdotally, if there were a large number of corporates which required restructuring, there would have been a noise in the marketplace. We are not seeing that noise in the marketplace. In fact, the noise that I hear when I talk to industry and to bankers is corporates are doing well and actually are deleveraging. To start with, if I were to take one index, and that will tell us the story of corporate India by and large. You remember in mid-90s, when we looked at, or late 90s, 3.8:1 was the debt to equity ratio, the total debt to equity ratio. 10 years back, it was around 1.8:1. Now, if you look at the Sensex, the top 50 companies, it is less than 0.5:1, with probably 25 to 30 companies having no debt at all. So there's a sea change in the way corporates have looked at how they should leverage themselves. And indeed, if you now look at it, I was looking at and tracking the 110 companies which have reported numbers, 35% PAT. And clearly this cash is not being thrown around. It is used to deleverage themselves. And hence, a question that arises, who will fund growth going forward? The answer is probably the first time in our economic history, corporates, I think, are generating enough cash to do, I would say, expansion at the margin, brownfield projects, and even greenfield projects. By and large, they're able to do with substantial cash from their books and some supportive debt from outside. This was the other way around in the past. Small cash from the books and large cash from this, which imposed risks. Areas where there was a risk, rightfully identified by the government. For example, in the corporate world, the SMEs. A helping hand was given, and I think that helping hand has worked. It's not to say that as we look at immediate future and the next 5 years, there won't be areas of pain. I think we know where those areas of pain is going to be. They can be seen now, and gentle handholding there is required. And I'm sure between the government, the policymakers, and the banks, that handholding will be left. But I will sum up to say that we are, I think, well on the road to Atmanirbharata. I think all the ground conditions are there. We have an economy recovered, which makes it provides us even more momentum, as it were. And I think the managers, our managers, corporate owners, or the managers are much the wiser for the crisis. And they have understood how to de-risk themselves in going forward. So in fact, I look at the environment with a feel-good atmosphere rather than a negative or an uncertain atmosphere.
And the government ownership of the banks, Mr. Kamath, there's been a lot of discussion around that since some time, actually, whether the government should own so many banks, and if at all, and how should they own, because there is a constant capital requirement and inefficiency and all of that.
That's a call the government has to take as a shareholder. Let me put this in context. I pick up a few, I would say, context from what Reserve Bank put out in their internal working group. Yeah. There were 2 points there which I think we need to mull over, not debate. That is the point they made about the capital increases that have happened over the last few years between the private sector banks and the public sector banks. Basically, that the rate at which capital has increased in the private sector banks through internal generation and through external access and raising from the market, juxtaposed with what has happened in the public sector, is one point that they made. Second is the way the private sector and the public sector have utilized this capital. Again, pointing to the fact that probably the better utilization is on the private sector side. I think these are pointers in terms of what requires to be done in a large part of the banking system. Because I don't think, let me rephrase it, I think public sector is going to be an important part of our banking system. We cannot wish it away, and neither should we. At this point in time, they are 60% of the assets of the system, and a strong public sector is required for us to meet our aspirations of at least the next 5 years growth. And let us see how it evolves as it goes along. But in the interim, the working group gave some pointers. I think these are also interesting pointers which we should look at and let the market decide how this happens. And as that happens, I'm sure the major shareholder of the public sector will take a call on what is the appropriate next step.
We did a small discussion amongst us in terms of what are the areas and the question we should touch upon with you. It's a long list, but there's one particular point which everybody was interested in, given that you've been advisors to a lot of corporates, formally or informally. What is your view on a family-owned corporate versus professionally run? Particularly now, there's a lot of FDI. Private equity buyout firms are buying corporates, and they are, they're managing it with the independent board. So, a professionally managed corporate managed by the professional manager versus the family managed companies. And because we are going through that transition, and you have seen that.
Sunil, this is a very interesting question. I've been thinking through this for quite a few years now, not 25 years, but at least last 5-10 years. See, if I go back to my earlier experience, which, the first 30 years of my experience, 1970, 71 to 2000, basically business was family run. And entrepreneurship came from the family. And you had a few professionals helping the family run business. I would think that the mass, what you call professionals who could run business, that mass started coming of age only post 2000. So our history is really, a very short history of professional management in our country. I would venture to say, let us learn from what happens elsewhere. And in some context, what's happening in our country, and I'll put it in context. You look at a typical startup in the US today. Typical startup is an individual entrepreneurial drive.
Yeah.
And at a certain stage, when it gets momentum, that entrepreneur and people who have backed him decide that to take it to the next level, you need to bring in, other drivers, as it were, to the fore. And the initial founder takes a backseat. He's still got an equity holding and so on. By and large, that is the model. There could be some who still want to steer it with their own hands for a few more years. That is fine. But if you look at our experience of the last 25 years of wealth creation in the US and the companies which have come up, this is by and large the model that has been run. I would think that is what will happen in India as we go along. We're already seeing that in a lot of family companies.
Yeah.
The next generation, this could be the second generation or third generation, is largely professionalized. And the family in business is reduced to one or two people. And as the mass of professionals increase, I think there is no option but for this to happen. I remember a very wise, advisor telling me long back, ultimately the best person should lead the company, whether it is from the family or outside. And this advisor was C.K. Prahlad. He would tell a group of, I would say, predominantly family leaders whom he used to have a sitting with every year for 2 or 3 days, that your leadership should be who is the best. The question that you should ask is who is the best. Is it somebody from the family or somebody from outside? And that person then should manage it. Not all family members, because then you'll have a problem. I think this is a part of an evolutionary path. And the next 5-10 years are also going to be driven by a different set of growth parameters in India. We talked about some industries, but we didn't talk about industries that will be born out of what I call the digital super cycle. And the digital super cycle companies will provide, my guess at this point in time, is at least 1/3 of the growth going ahead. This is something entirely new. I don't think anywhere in the world that extent of momentum has been provided by companies which come out of new developments in the last 10 years. That includes everything digital and everything that leverages digital. It need not be digital, but it could be e-commerce which leverages digital at one end and pure digital play at the other end, digital fintech in between. So all these will drive it. And all these, if you see, are, the business is spawned by an entrepreneur who thinks through the whole thing and thinks through a business model and gets it going. I'm sure as they go along, it will go the Western way, where a lot of them very quickly will need to bring in external professional management. And I think that will also be seen by, I would say, businesses which are firmly on the ground, manufacturing companies, the infrastructure companies, and so on. And this will be, I would say, a very wise move as we go along, as the whole pool of professionals increases, the need for professional leadership increases, and the owners, the true owners of these companies, then decide what is the best course forward. But change will happen, that's for sure. I think at this point in time, gold is, everything around us is too unpredictable. We see a very strong capital market, we see growth momentum and so on, but the variables are too many in the system, and having a small part of gold in your portfolio could be a very wise. The question that really arises in India is at an individual level, is there a disproportionately high level of gold in the hands of individuals, and do they need to hold that? I think that is the question. And again, my view is this has been an age-old practice. Some of it is deeply ingrained, and honestly, holding of gold may not decline. Holding of other assets will increase, making that gold holding look to be appropriate size or a smaller as compared to the overall holding. I think that's what will happen as ownership of diversified asset classes increases in the hands of public. Beyond that, I would think some gold in the hands is good. but too much probably is, again, you're concentrating risk in your portfolio.
Yeah. My question was more, there's a discussion around monetizing gold. So let's say Temple, the gold which is lying with Temple, if that gets monetized, there is that much of resources available in the country in general. And there are different schemes which were also talked about. Any view around that, Mr. Kamath?
Yeah, again, as I said, I'm no expert. I do not know how much is sentiment here and how much is this, because beyond sentiment, an institution holding gold, I can't see necessarily the merit in it. Again, their own holding pattern should be risk diversification or through asset diversification. If that is so, immediately that gold probably can be used for other purposes, and your asset classes could change. So yes, again, the sentiment aspect has to be carefully understood before proceeding on this, I would think.
I'm being pinged with number of questions and all from one range to the other, but I'm going to close with this request to you, is that we do know from the media that you participated in the discussion which happened with the leadership in the government on the budget as a pre-budget. I don't want you to share any of those discussions, but anything, your own perspective on expectations from the budget.
Sunil, I've all these years, well nigh 50 years, I've refrained from talking about the budget because I think this is a governmental exercise, and our talking about it is probably wishful thinking at best. So I have refrained from talking about it. I think we are in very able hands in terms of the team that leads us, and I would fully support the outcomes that they would place before us. I think they have done an admirable job in the last 1 year, and I look at it with the same, I would say, positive view. Clearly, what we should do is cheer them as a set a 5-year goal and a 10-year goal, hopefully, and we should all strive to achieve that. And I'm sure we will, given the momentum that this pandemic has provided us, be able to achieve these heights that we aspire to.
Let me twist this and rephrase this. I'm trying to get at least you to give us some hint. There is a conversation and the media report about DFI, and no one better than you know this. You've dealt with it. Any views on that, Mr. Kamath? On
DFI? Yeah, I'm clear. The DFI can work. You see, what has happened is, again, if you look at pre-1995 or 96, and then the next 10 to 15 years and current period. Pre-95 was the DFI world, all lending for asset creation. Physical asset creation was through the DFI, not the bank, predominantly. Then came the next 15 years where it went from DFIs to the banks. And now the banks clearly are saying, hey, wait a minute, we are not the right entities to lend for an infrastructure project for 10 to 15 years. We are probably not even right for manufacturing companies for longer tenures. We will play in fields where our asset and our liability are matched. I think we can't blame them. So who funds? Who funds the requirement of? I mentioned that certain items have to be looked at even in the budget. Probably could be looked at separately. But there is a whole lot of investment happening from the private sector, and there's a whole lot of investment that could be happening even from the government. So at this point in time, a development bank, I would call it a long-term lending structure. I think absolutely a requirement. And again, before we set up the new development bank, we had the BRICS Bank, we had a similar thought. Do we require another development bank? But having looked at what is possible, I think gives me confidence to say that that's the model that is now required. With only one caveat, the bank will have to be of a sufficient size to meet aspirations. So if you see the last 20, 25 minutes that we have talked about, I come back to this word aspiration, because I think the government is setting an aspiration. We have to meet those aspirations. But in a very narrow sense, when you talk of a long-term lending institution, I would think it has to be of a sufficient size, which will meet this aspirational growth.
Yeah. The critical part there would be is how do you manage the liability part?
Very simple. Very simple. Again, why did DFIs fail in 1995? Because the crutch that was given to the DFIs, that is, you could you were like a government SLR bond. Your
Correct.
bonds could be subscribed and you were survived. Once that was removed, you had a collapse. And you did not have a system whereby long-term liabilities were available through the marketplace. And the marketplace could have been people like insurance companies, pension funds, and so on, because it didn't exist. There was only one insurance company. Today, the situation is different. So today, there is a structure. So in fact, I would think that setting up this institution will be a good way to provide momentum to the bond market also. So it does two things: provides funds and becomes the channel for creating and pushing forward the bond market.
Mr. Kamath, I'm sure everyone who listens to you will agree that ET couldn't have got a better person like you than to give a perspective for the next 5 years or even beyond as to how we transition and what changes are going to happen. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you, Bill.